Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very exciting event. Thank you for being here. This is our first public event with Black Catholic Messenger in quite some time, and I am absolutely elated that it's with our new friend, Dan Gediman, who is joining us to share on the topic of how to use Catholic Church records to find enslaved ancestors. I was personally encouraged by Dan to use the Reckoning Inc. resources, and I made some interesting discoveries of my own about my family history, which includes several African American Catholics, some of whom have possibly were enslaved by fellow church members. It's a remarkable sort of thing to discover, and it is part of our history in America. So I'm very grateful that Dan has agreed to come today and share with us on the tools that are offered to us through Reckoning. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to Dan, who will be leading the event. Dan Gediman is Executive Director of the nonprofit organization Reckoning Inc. and Executive Producer of the radio and podcast series The Reckoning, Facing the Legacy of Slavery in America and the Copperhead Conspiracy. He is a longtime public radio producer whose work has been heard on All Things Considered, Morning Edition, Marketplace, and This American Life. For many years, Dan was the executive producer of the popular public radio series This I Believe. He has also edited 9 This I Believe books, including the New York Times bestseller, This I Believe, The Personal Philosophies of Remarkable Men and Women. Again, I want to thank Dan for being here with us today, and I also want to note for everyone who's joining us to watch that this webinar will be recorded and sent to everyone. It will also be available immediately on our YouTube channel. And one last thing, there is a Q&A feature. The chat feature is turned off, but if you look at the bottom right of your screen here, there should be a square made up of 9 little dots. You can click on that. There will be a button there for Q&A. If you click on that, you can then add a question. I also want to note that Dan will be sharing a lot of information during this presentation, so he may be answering some of the questions that you may think up along the way. So maybe note them and keep them to yourselves until towards the end, and you can submit them if they've not been answered. And thank you all again for joining us. And Dan, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Nate, for having me and for helping to promote the work that we're doing at Reckoning Inc. in your publication. Really appreciate that. And I'm so glad all of you are here. And I'm going to assume if you're in the audience for this, that you have some interest in this subject. Perhaps you know for a fact, maybe you are yourself Catholic. Maybe you know that you have ancestors who were Catholic. Maybe you know that you have ancestors who were enslaved by Catholic people. If any of those are true, then we may have information that we can help you with your journey with trying to learn more about your ancestors. So what we're going to do in this presentation, we're going to start off with some sort of big picture information about Catholicism and slavery. Then we're going to dig into a case history of one particular family that was enslaved by Catholics in Nelson County, Kentucky. And then we're going to look at the case history of someone who was also enslaved in that same county and enslaved by a religious order. So that's kind of the big picture of what we're going to be covering here. And hopefully you'll be able to take usable information from this that you can put to immediate work in your own research journey. So, hold on. There we go. Sorry, I'm trying to look at 2 different things at the same time. So, the earliest Jesuit priests in the Americas believed that the enslaved people, the people who were being enslaved in the Americas, should be given the opportunity to get the Catholic sacraments if their enslavers were Catholic. As a result, enslaved Black people start to appear in the records of Catholic churches in Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Louisiana in particular. The earliest records are in Louisiana, then in Maryland, then in Kentucky, then in Missouri, in that order chronologically. There are baptismal records, marriage records, and death records recorded alongside that of white Catholics. Enslaved and free Black people alike often acted as sponsors for each other during baptism. They could not, however, be a sponsor for a white person's baptism. So these are sort of the ground rules that were established by the church in the Americas early on, or at least in North America. I'll speak to North America. The first white families to arrive in Kentucky. So let me back up and say that our organization, Reckoning Inc., which is a nonprofit based in Louisville, Kentucky, has mostly focused our attention on the history of enslavement in Kentucky. And we sort of backed into the work that we're doing with Catholic Church records because we started to find a lot of Catholic Church records that had been transcribed by a white priest in the mid-20th century, and started to realize rather quickly in looking at those transcriptions how much deep information was contained within them, specifically about enslaved people. So the first white families arrive in Kentucky in the late 18th century, coming from mostly Maryland, occasionally Virginia. Some of these families, many of them Catholic, settled in Nelson County, which is one of the oldest counties in Kentucky. It's in the central part of the state. Some of them kept moving toward western Kentucky, and there are Catholic churches in the western part of Kentucky as well. As the white Catholic families migrated and grew in Kentucky, so too did the Black Catholic families that they enslaved. The pictures on your screen are two people who were enslaved by Catholic orders in Kentucky. On the left, you see a man named Peter Hawkins, who was enslaved by the Jesuits of, sorry, I take that back. These were folks who were enslaved outside of Kentucky. The first is Peter Hawkins on the left. He was enslaved by the Jesuits of Georgetown University College fame. On the right, Eliza Nesbitt, who was enslaved by the Sisters of Charity of the Sacred Heart and repeatedly asked to be allowed to be a sister and was repeatedly denied. So these surviving sacramental records in the Catholic Church, there are issues. First of all, most of them are in Latin, so they have to be translated to English. Handwritten originals that have to be turned into typed copies. So for the most part, the records that we have found in Kentucky are Latin to English typed transcriptions. As such, there may be occasional spelling and grammatical errors. Also, priests were not always consistent about the information they recorded. There doesn't seem to be a template for exactly what information to include in a baptismal record of an enslaved person. So some of them, for instance, only mention the name of the child and the enslaver. Some of them mention the child's name, the mother's name, and the enslaver's name. Some of them mention the mother and father's name and who each of them were enslaved by, unless one of them was a free person of color. So just know that the information that you may find online on our website, reckoninginc.org, may not be consistent from person to person. There may be some missing information. We have indexed records from 23 Catholic churches in the Louisville and Central Kentucky area, put them on our website. They're available in two ways that we'll show you in a little bit, as a searchable database and as a sortable spreadsheet. These include roughly 450 slavery-era baptismal, marriage, and burial records. We've also indexed another 1,400 post-emancipation baptismal, marriage, and burial records. And these are important because they help us connect the enslaved Black families who were only referred to by first name and the freed Black families who often were members of the same churches, remained members of the same church after emancipation. And for instance, let's say they had their first three children during slavery and their next three children after slavery. By being able to look in the post-slavery baptismal records, we can find the surnames of these families and put family trees together. And that's exactly what we've done. Slavery era records exist online for Catholic churches in other states in some sort of form. So that includes Maryland, Missouri, and Louisiana. There are other Catholic churches around the country who have put their records online, but they're not necessarily in areas where either slavery was commonplace, or they didn't include the records of enslaved people. So, for example, the Boston Archdiocese has allowed all of their records to be put online, and it's a beautifully done project, and they're all digitized. But they didn't include any enslaved records, and there might have been some enslaved records from early in the history of the Boston Archdiocese while slavery still sort of existed in Massachusetts. Not sure, but either way, they're not available there. Many of these online records are simply scans of the original handwritten documents, often in Latin. There are some efforts by various entities in these various states to digitize Catholic sacramental records. Some people associated with that are on this call. When those activities are completed, it may conceptually be possible to trace an individual enslaved person or an individual enslaved family from when they first came to the United States, or what was then the British colonies, in the 1600s. At the point where Catholics arrived in Maryland and started to purchase slaves, to 1865. It's conceptually possible. If we could get the records, for instance, for Maryland and Missouri, and in addition, and Louisiana, in addition to Kentucky, actually digitized, there might be a way to follow those forward in time. There may still be ways of doing that, but it will require a lot of legwork. Currently, the earliest available online baptismal records that I know of date from 1760 in Maryland, and you're looking at one of those records on the screen right now, and they contain many records for enslaved children. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this is an example of one that only tells us the name of the child and the name of the enslaver. Okay, so this is our website at reckoninginc.org, reckoninginc.org, and at the end of this presentation, we'll put up on the screen a QR code where you can connect to our website. But if you want to, look on your device and start to poke around, you certainly can. reckoninginc.org. So when you go there and you click on church records, it'll take you to this screen, and we have a variety of tools there. And we're going to show you how to start to use that. So one of the first things you can do is, let's just say you know for a fact, or you've heard through family oral history, that your family, ancestors in your family used to live in Kentucky, and you think they were in a certain church, affiliated with a certain church. Then you can look on the list of churches that we have. Or perhaps you simply know what county within Kentucky they were enslaved. Ditto for that. You can just browse through the records by county. And in some of these counties, there are multiple Catholic churches. That can be very helpful to be able to look at all of the church records from that county at one time. Now, you can, if you know, again, through family oral history, an enslaver name associated with your family, or maybe you've learned that name through your other kinds of research you've done, then you can put the name in here and see if we have any records pertaining to that enslaver. And then, of course, you can look for records by the name of the enslaved person. Currently, in terms of our database, it's built around baptismal records. So if, for instance, a person was married in the church or buried in the church, they won't show up yet in this database in terms of our search tools. But I'm going to show you in a little bit another way you can find those records through a spreadsheet that we have on our website. So you could search by a familiar name that you've heard. So let's say in a lot of families, this is true for white and black families all over the world, a lot of times there are recurring names, right? So there are certain names for male children and female children that recur generationally. Every 3 generations or 4 generations, you have an Albert, or you have a Sarah, right? So you could put a name that you've heard through oral history, or that you know for a fact. You have an ancestor, a second great grandparent with the surname X. sorry, not the surname, the Christian name, the first name X. And maybe, right, you could also put a last name that you think might have been associated with the family. But I would start perhaps by just experimenting with the first name and if you know roughly when they were born. So we're going to pick one family that we've done research on and show you how we learn things in the same way that you would learn them if you were working from the present moment backwards, because that's how most of us do genealogy, right? So let's say you have done a good bit of research into your own family, and you know the names of your great-grandparents, let's say, and you have some access to an online genealogical website. If you're on this call, maybe you've already done some research on one of the dominant platforms. There's really three biggies. Ancestry in in North America is the biggest. In Europe and elsewhere abroad, it's myheritage.com. And then there is familysearch.org, which is free. Both of the other Ancestry and MyHeritage charge, monthly or annual fees. But familysearch.org is free. But one way or the other, let's say, for the sake of the discussion, you've worked your family back to 1880, okay? And you have found a record of your ancestors living, for the sake of the discussion, in Nelson County, Kentucky, okay? And it just so happens we have the most records of enslaved Black people in Nelson County, Kentucky, because Nelson County was the place where Catholics first came to in the Western United States. It was the first diocese outside of Maryland, the first Catholic schools outside of Maryland, the first seminaries, the first everything related to Catholicism outside of Maryland were in, very specifically, the Nelson County area in Kentucky. So we're going to look at this particular family. And they are Harry and Julia Reed, a married couple, who have a series of children that show up here in this 1880 census. Note the name of the mother-in-law. Okay, so we have a mother-in-law down almost to the bottom of the page. Her name is Mary Greenwell. So that could be a clue. So if you were to find a mother-in-law or a father-in-law or a grandparent, right, in that family unit, and they have a different surname, that's an important piece of information, because in many of these families, there are multiple surnames at work, sometimes in the same generation, in the same family, meaning you might have 5 siblings using a combination of 2 or 3 different surnames. So it's always good to note any of these names that you find along the way. So we're going to kind of put in our memory banks the surname Greenwell, okay? Because for one thing, since she is listed as the mother-in-law of the head of household, which is the father, the husband, Harry, that means that she's the mother of Julia, who is the wife, okay? So also, always look for neighbors. Always look for neighbors when you're looking at census documents. So in this case, we note a white couple at the bottom of the page, William and Anne W. Ritchie. Okay. Now, many Black families after emancipation continued to work for the white families that enslaved them as domestic servants, as farmhands, tenant farmers, sharecroppers. So if you see a Black family in the 1880 or 1870 census living right next door to a white family, they very well may have been their former enslavers. Okay. Now, we're going to look. So let's say you're in the situation where you want to go farther backwards, right? Because that's what we're always doing when we're doing genealogical research. So you found them in the 1880 census. So you want to go look for them in the 1870 census, and you put in the information that you know. So you put in Harry Reed, okay, because that's the name that was in the 1880 census. Now, I recommend that you put variations of the first name. So, for instance, I happen to know that Harry is a diminutive of Henry. So I would put Henry and Harry into the search field just to make sure that we don't miss them, okay? And we're going to include Nelson County, Kentucky, and check the box for exact to this place. When we do that, sorry, let me back one screen. We're also going to put in the names of the children that we found in the 1880 census, okay? And we're also going to check for race, nationality. We're going to put black and put exact, okay? So we get some exact matches, because remember, we may have multiple families in the same place, black and white, with the same names, oftentimes the enslaver and the enslaved. Now, if you don't find anybody using black, go back and do it again and put in mulatto, which was also used in the 1870 census. Why they used it, I just recently learned, and it's crazy stuff, but they convinced Congress to put in mulatto as a race in the 1870 and 1880 census in particular, because social or scientists of the time were convinced that two people of mixed race could not have children, just like mules. Mulatto, mule, mulatto, it's the same word in Spanish. And so they were convinced that two mixed race people couldn't have children, but they wanted to prove their hypothesis, so they convinced Congress to add mulatto to the census as a race to see if they were right. And sure enough, they were dead wrong. Nonetheless, we are left with some people being listed as black, some people being listed as mulatto, purely based on the census taker and whether they thought the person was dark-skinned or light-skinned. So do it both ways. Now, in this case, we don't find anything under the name Harry Reid. So let's try it again. But this time, let's leave out the second name. Let's only put in the first name and leave out the last name, okay, and see what comes up. So when we do that, we find a whole bunch of people, okay, named Harry. And at the top of the list, we find a Harry Douglas, okay? And he's married to a Julia A. Douglas. And the birth years fit, roughly speaking. And for those of you who haven't done a lot of genealogical research, you're going to find a wide variety of ages for your ancestors in the census records, because in many cases, most cases, when the census takers came to the house to take the census, the people who lived there weren't even there. They were at work. So this is especially true for working class people. So in many cases, they're depending on an elder who might be living there or a neighbor who may not have very good information, and they may just be shooting in the dark. Oh, I think he's about 50 years old. Oh, I think she's about 35 years old. I think she's 10 years older than he is, right? That kind of thing. So don't freak out if everything fits, but the birth year is off by 5 years. That's not anywhere out of the ordinary. So let's keep looking at Harry and Julia A. Douglas, since we couldn't find anyone named Reed. And sure enough, we find this family, okay? And we find at least two of the children are the same names that we saw in the 1880 census, Alexander and Henry, with roughly the correct ages. So that tells us this is probably the right family. Now, remember I said always look for the next door neighbors. Well, the next door neighbors are Nace, which is short for Ignatius, and Henny, short for Henrietta Douglas. And they're all showing the same last name, and the census taker has put ditto marks under Douglas, leading us to believe this is one big family, one big extended family. And in all likelihood, those are the parents of Henry/Harry. Okay, why they're using the name Douglas, don't know yet. Okay, but that's the name they're showing up with. Now, I will tell you parenthetically that after slavery, lots of Black families chose major figures in American history, right? So there's lots of Washingtons and Jeffersons and Lincolns and Jacksons and Douglases for Frederick Douglass, right? So you had lots of people who were just inventing a surname for their family rather than taking a family name from one of their previous enslavers. All right, so because Harry is a common diminutive for Henry, it looks like I'm going to try looking now for a child named Henry And I'm going to do this now in our records, our church records, okay? And remember I told you there's a couple of different ways of looking at this. Well, one of the ways of looking at our data is in a spreadsheet form, okay? And in this spreadsheet, you can sort by any of the columns in the spreadsheet. You can sort by first name, last name of the child. You can sort by the mother's first name. You can sort by the birth year. There's all sorts of different ways you can sort this. So I'm going to look for a Harry born roughly in 1832, likely in Nelson County, because that's where the family was living in 1870, and his birth year was 1832. So I'm going to see if I could find anybody that fits those characteristics. And bingo, I do. I find a John Henry with parents named Nace and Henny. Okay, and remember, we saw the next door neighbors in the 1870 census, Nace and Henny Douglas, living right next door to Harry Douglas. So we're pretty sure this is exactly the baptismal record for the man we saw in the census records. And now we have confirmation that these are his parents. Okay, so whereas before they were just neighbors, now we know that they're parents and grandparents to the children. Now, I wanted to go look and see if I could find Julia, right? And according to the 1870 census, she's born in 1832. We also know that her mother was named Mary, and she was probably enslaved by someone named Greenwell. Now, the closest we've got to this is for a girl named Juliana or Julina, born in 1831 to a mother named Mary, and she's enslaved in Nelson County. Okay, so far so good. So we're pretty sure this is our Julia. And now we look a little further and we find a marriage record for Henry and Julianne. So remember, we told you there's baptismal records, there's marriage records, there's death records. So we clearly see them having been married in the church at St. Thomas Church, happens to be the oldest Catholic church in Kentucky, indeed the oldest Catholic church west of Baltimore, to my knowledge. And we have the names of their respective enslavers. So for Henry, we have William Ritchie. Now remember, in the 1880 census, he's the white next door neighbor, William Ritchie, okay? And for Julianne, we have Ignatius Greenwell. And if you remember, in the 1880 census, Julia's mother is listed as Mary Greenwell, which tracks with what we know of Julia and Mary's enslaver of record. So this is for sure the right couple, okay? So now we know enslaver names of both of the parents. Again, this is information you could not find if you didn't have access to church records, right? You couldn't discern any of this information just from the census records or any other kind of legal records that you might find in courthouses around the country. So that's why these church records are so critically important, and why I've been trying really hard, and other people on this call have been trying really hard, to convince the various dioceses and archdioceses around the country to make these records available, especially for African Americans, because it's so critical to be able to go back and find these ancestor names, and in particular, the ancestors' enslavers' names. Because once we know the ancestors' enslavers, we can learn a lot more, and we can go back more generations in the family tree. So now we're going to look at baptismal records for Julianne as a mother, Julia Ann as a mother. So this is definitely the right woman, right? So this is, remember I told you, you can sort by different columns in the spreadsheet. So I sorted by first name of the mother. Okay, and then as I did that, I was able to see a bunch of children born to Julia Ann, and for most of them, the husband is listed either as Harry or John Henry, which was his baptismal name. Take note of the surnames of the enslavers, because they could be clues to why they used certain surnames after emancipation. So we see three names here. We see Greenwell for Julia Ann, and we see two names for Harry/Henry. Sometimes we see Ritchie, sometimes we see Reed. And remember, Reed is the name that he shows up using in the 1880 census. Greenwell matches the name used by Julianne's mother in the 1880 census, and Reed matches the family name that they were using in the census. But there's no one named Douglas. Okay. And I'll tell you in advance, I looked very, very hard up the family trees of all the enslavers of these families, and I could find no one named Douglas. So that's why I think that Henry's father, Ignatius Nace, took the name of Douglas just because he decided to do so and because he admired Frederick Douglass. This is a guess. It's an educated guess. All right, so let's look at what we know so far from all the information we've gleaned from all of these records, okay? So from the 18, we know certain things from the church records. We found baptismal records for a certain number of kids. In the 1870 census, we find a different mixture of kids. And in the 1880 census, we find a different mixture of kids. Now, why are some of them missing, right? Well, they could have died between birth and the 1870 census, or for some of the older ones, they could have already gone off and started their own family. They could have gotten married and started their own family, and they might show up in the census under some other name, okay? And we don't know what that name is. So there are a couple of these children of the Reed family that I couldn't find. So any number of explanations could explain that. Most likely either death, or they left the family, moved out on their own with a to be determined last name. Okay. Now, there is a daughter who shows up in the 1880 census, Henrietta, who doesn't show up anywhere prior to that point. Okay, she doesn't show up in the baptismal records. She doesn't show up in 1870. So there are certain explanations for this. There were two things that were quite common in Kentucky during this period. One is that poor families hired out their children to work for other people, right? So children as young as 7, 8, 9 were being employed as domestic workers for a white family, for example. So that's a possibility. And then there's another possibility. It's an extremely dark side of Kentucky's history, but starting in 1866 with the adoption of the Kentucky Black Laws, they introduced apprenticeship, and I'm putting it in air quotes. What they called apprenticeship was basically that the courts could take any child away from their parents if they felt that those children were not properly employed. Okay, so this is only used with poor children, both poor white children and mostly poor black children. So if they couldn't show that they were working for a white family, they would be taken away from the parents and put in an apprenticeship with another white family, which effectively was putting them back into slavery. They didn't have to be paid. It was just a room and board thing, and they were supposed to learn a trade, which could simply have been learning how to be a domestic servant or learning how to be an agricultural worker, okay? And they were not obliged to be to be freed from that apprenticeship relationship until they turned, I think, 21. And by the way, that continued to be the law of the land in Kentucky until 1892. So we don't know why Henrietta all of a sudden appears in the family records in 1880, but that is a possibility. Okay, so I remember I told you how important it is to go looking in the white families to try to get explanations for why the black families are carrying certain names, okay, or why certain white people show up in their records. So I'm looking here at the family tree of the woman who shows up as Harry's enslaver, and her name is Anne W. Ritchie. And I learned that she was first married to a man named William Reed, okay? And I learned that her father's name, okay, this is the white woman who's the enslaver, was a guy named Samuel Balmer, sometimes spelled Balmer, okay? And his name shows up in the Nelson County records, church records, as an enslaver, as it does for his wife, known as the widow Balmer or Mrs. Balmer. Now, we're going to hold on to that name for later, okay, Balmer. Now, note the names of her children. So she has a son, William Reed, but also a daughter, Anne Eliza Miles, who we learn married a guy named Henry Miles. Hold that name in your head, Henry Miles. Now, searching in both Ancestry and Fold 3, I had a feeling, given the age of Henry/Harry Reed, that he might have been a soldier. And sure enough, I find a guy named Harry Reed being an enslaved man in Kentucky, joining the army, and his enslaver is listed as Henry Miles. Then he's the husband of Anne Eliza Reed, the daughter of Anne Ritchie Reed. Okay, so this is not uncommon. A child gets married, and they are given enslaved people as part of their dowry. This is specifically true with a woman when she's marrying. So it's entirely possible that Harry, was essentially given to the daughter, Anne Eliza, and her husband, Henry, as part of her dowry. Okay? But either way, he's the enslaver of record when he enters the military. Okay? Now, I was able to find military records for Harry Reid. I found his pension card, okay, which lists him, Harry Reid, and his wife, Julia Reid. And this gives us some additional information, including that his wife applies for a widow's pension in July of 1900. That gives us an approximate idea of when he died. And by the way, this would be just as true for a white person doing research into their family if they had a Civil War soldier ancestor. Is that these index cards for military pensions are an absolute treasure trove of information. Okay, and what's even more of a treasure trove are the actual pension files that these cards indicate. So the numbers at the bottom of this card, okay, where it says application number and certificate number, give you everything you need to look up to order that pension file. So let's say you get this far in your research and you find you have an ancestor who served in the military during the Civil War. You can order these files. Now, for right at this moment in time, it is a terrible time to try to order records from the National Archives. I'm not even sure if you still can. However, there's a company named Gopher Records, Gopher, gopherrecords.com, that we use all the time. They are fast and inexpensive. For $45, you can order a pension file, and they'll deliver it to you within a couple of weeks in your email box. Actually, they'll send you a link, and then you download it. So I ordered Harry Reid's pension file. It's 98 pages long, which is sort of average in length. Some of them are hundreds and hundreds of pages long. It's filled with letters, affidavits, and depositions from people who knew him or his wife before, during, or after the Civil War. And so sometimes these are first-person accounts, actual verbatim transcripts of a deposition. And sometimes it's your ancestors speaking across time through these verbatim transcripts. And this is especially true for families where the eldest ancestors were illiterate. So they didn't leave behind letters. They didn't leave behind any memoirs or any other journals or anything like that. This could be the only way you could get to sort of hear the voice across the decades of your ancestors. So from looking in the pension file, we see that at the time that they were married in the church, she was listed, they say her maiden name was Julia Hagan, Hagan, okay? So that's interesting, because previously we've only ever seen Greenwell as the enslaver, Ignatius Greenwell. So that leads me to believe that at some point in the past, either Julia or her mother, because remember, slavery is matrilineal, so the children of an enslaved woman become the property of the enslaver of that woman. So this leads me to believe there was at some point, a Hagan family that enslaved Julia's family. Okay. However, when we later in the pension file, it lists the name that she was that she used when she had their marriage legally declared legal. There was a process. This was true in all the counties of Kentucky. It was probably true in other states, but I know for a fact in Kentucky that it was done starting in 1866, that if you had been married during enslavement, you could go to a county courthouse and swear that you had been married for 10 years or 15 years, and they would give you essentially an official marriage license after the fact. Okay, and this is the information that they used when they did that. And so she's listed there as Julia Greenwell. Okay. So that means it's entirely possible that at the time that they were married in the church, she was enslaved by the Hagans, And by the time it's the after the war, and they're having their marriage officiated, she refers to herself as Greenwell. So either way, it's good to know these two names. Now, knowing that the man that Harry Reid was enslaved by at the time he enlisted was Henry Miles, I was able to go on FamilySearch.org and look at the Freedmen's Bank records. And I found by the way, these are free. You can look for them for free on Family Search. And I found that in 1866, shortly after Harry mustered out of the army with his enlistment bonus, which was up to $300, he deposits money in the Freedmen's Bank branch in Louisville. So this is another way to get some additional information about this family. All right, earlier we found Harry's parents in the 1870 census living as Nace and Henny Douglas. Now in 1880, we find a widowed woman calling herself Henrietta Ballmeyer, living with her adult daughter, Letty, short for Letitia, and her husband, Edward Thomas. So this woman, Letty, is the sister to Julia Ann, and this is their mother, now living as a widowed woman, and she has reverted to the name that she used, okay, which was Ballmer, which was the name of her enslaver. Okay, so this leads us to believe that the Douglas name was probably something adopted by her husband Nace, probably in homage to Frederick Douglass. And when Nace died, she decided to use the surname of her former enslavers, who were Samuel and Priscilla Ballmer, the parents of Anne Reed Ritchie, okay, who was Harry Reid's enslaver. So, that's what we know about her. Searching again in the 1900 census, we find Harry and Julia Ann Reed, R-E-E-D, living with a granddaughter, Pearl Douglas. So that tells us that this family used both names, Douglas and Reed, after emancipation. And sure enough, by the way, I was able to find other siblings of Harry, including a couple who joined the army themselves, who used the name Douglas. Okay, and that's probably the father of Pearl Douglas here. Okay. I also note that Julia had a total of 10 children, only 4 of them living as of 1900, which probably explains why her 17-year-old granddaughter is living with her grandparents. It's entirely possible her parents died of tuberculosis or typhoid or, any number of ways that people died at that point in time. And then again, in 1910, Julia is widowed and living with her granddaughter, Pearl Douglas. Okay. I was trying to keep this to an hour and then leave time for question and answers. So I'm going to kind of rush through this a little bit, but just wanted to tell you that this is not that unusual. This family shows up with 4 different names associated with it: Greenwell, Ritchie, Reed, and Douglas. Okay. So, your family, when you go back in time and look for records of your family, don't be alarmed if you find people who match what you know of your ancestors in every way other than the surname, because it's very fluid. Here we have a family just in a 10-year period who go from being known as Douglas to being known as Reed. Okay, you have a woman, and then same thing with Henny, the grandmother. She goes from being known as Henny Douglas to Henny Ballmer in a couple of, in a 10-year period, or rather in a 20-year period. So, no, 10-year period from 1870 to 1880. All right, so now let's keep going. And by the way, this is a picture of the family tree we've developed for this family, and we've been able to take it all the way down. We found they had 10 children, 20 grandchildren, great-grandchildren, 2 times great-grandchildren, and 3 times great-grandchildren who are living today. Okay, so there are 3 generations of their descendants who are alive today. 3 generations, okay? And I've met one of them. Okay, so there's all sorts of things we can learn from this mixture of church records, military records, civilian records, okay? So we're going to do a much quicker dive here with the second family that we're going to look at, mostly to let those of you I'm assuming a lot of people on this call are either Catholic or they were, they have Catholic relatives. It is a fact that there were a variety of Catholic clergy and Catholic religious orders who were also enslavers. So of the records we have found so far, just in Kentucky, we found 196 records where the enslaver of record was a priest, a bishop, a religious order, or a church school. Okay. Now it gets very complicated when you're looking for records pertaining to people that they enslaved. This is especially true for the religious orders. So for instance, the work that we're doing is supported by two religious orders, the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth and the Sisters of Loretto. And in both cases, people they enslaved were simply show up in the records as Sarah Loretto, Ignatius Nazareth. Okay, they don't show up with a surname of their own. Okay, and we're going to see this in the gentleman that we're going to look at right now. So this is a guy who was known before and after the war as Nace Bean, B-E-A-N. Okay, however, when he entered into the military, they immediately gave, in Kentucky, this was the way they did things, they would immediately give you the last name of your enslaver of record. Well, in this case, the enslaver of record is a religious order, so they just gave him the last name Nazareth. So we'll see that in a sec. So when he enters into when he enlists in the military, a clerk simply calls him Ignatius Nazareth. Now, I happened to find this record when I was looking for something else entirely. And because I already knew about the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth and I already knew that they had enslaved people, I put two and two together and I thought, well, let's see what else we can find out about this man. So remember earlier, I showed you these pension index cards that are found on they're found on Ancestry, they're found on Family Search. So I found such a card for this Ignatius Bean, and then it says alias Ignatius Nazareth. So these cards, these pension index cards, are like a Rosetta Stone, because once you find the information in there that tells you the name that they were known by after enslavement and often during enslavement, and the name they served in the military by, now all of a sudden you have a portal into looking into records for their military records that might give you additional information about their enslavers, okay? But in our case, it cements the fact that these are the same man. Ignatius Bean and Ignatius Nazareth are the same person. So now I knew to go looking for a Nace Bean, right? And I happen to know that Nace is short for Ignatius. And sure enough, I find this family in the 1770 and 1780 census. I find his wife listed. She is sometimes called Clarice, sometimes called Clarissa. It's obviously the same person. Then I'm able to go look in the church records. And if we look in the church records to see if we could find, I looked in the baptismal records, and I find a baptismal record for the approximate name that I got from both the military and census records, and bingo, I find him. Okay. Now I went looking for, remember earlier we talked about how they, if you were enslaved during, if you were married during slavery, you could go after the fact to a court and fill out a form and get, have your marriage certified. Well, this is what they did, okay? And interestingly, she lists her name as, so here it's listed as Stewart, okay? However, elsewhere in other records that we found as I was researching this family, I found that her daughter's death certificate lists the mother's maiden name as Strother, S-T-R-O-T-H-E-R. For those of you old enough to remember All in the Family, Sally Strother, one of the actors, it's likely the same family or a version of it. So when I went looking in the baptismal records, I find a record for Alfred and Naomi, okay, as parents of young Clarissa and their respective enslavers, John Strother and Alexander Hunter. So now we know the names of Clarissa's enslavers, and we know the name of her parents, Alfred and Naomi. Again, we couldn't have known this without this mixture of church records, military records, and civilian records. So, in brief, but using these combination of records, we were able to, again, as we did with this other family, take this family all the way down to the present. I don't expect you to see all the names or anything, but over on the far left side of the screen, you see somebody on the very bottom. That's a living relative who is, and this person, is now aware of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations of her family, including, by the way, we were able to learn the mother's name, essentially the grandmother of the children of the Beans, Nace and Clarissa, her mother, who doesn't otherwise show up in any records. She doesn't show up in the census records, but we were able to figure it out through the church records and kind of used some triangulation. So as I mentioned, here is a QR code for our website. I'm going to drink some water real quick here. And if you go to our website, which is reckoninginc.org, you can find all the records we've been talking about. Hold on, I'm coughing again. I'm going to mute for 1 second. Nate, maybe you could start working on questions.
So from what I see in our chat currently, there are not any questions, but I will remind everyone who is viewing that you can click on the meeting tools on the bottom right of your screen. It looks like 9 little dots in the shape of a square. And then you will see a Q&A button, and you can add questions there. Please do not try to use the chat function to add questions, as that will not work. But you should all have access to the Q&A feature. But Dan, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Which you have answered for me before, but I would love for you to answer for everyone else, about why, and you explained some of this, but why, again, is Kentucky so important for people who are generally trying to find African-American ancestors who were possibly enslaved by other Kentuckians?
Thank you. So, yes, I should have stressed this further. Kentucky was an exporter of enslaved people. Okay, so along with Virginia, it was one of the biggest exporters of enslaved people. So, just a quick history lesson: the transatlantic slave trade was abolished legally in the early 1800s. I think 1806, if I remember correctly. And so, from that point on, if you were an enslaver in the United States and you wanted to purchase an enslaved person, you had to do that through a domestic slave trading market. Okay, so Kentucky became a net exporter of slaves, and there was a thriving business of exporting slaves from Kentucky to the slave markets of Natchez, Mississippi, and New Orleans, Louisiana. Okay, and in particular, Kentucky sent a lot of people to Louisiana. Now, I have done research into the slave trade in the Catholic counties of central Kentucky, and they predominantly did business with other Catholic slave traders, in particular in Louisiana. Okay, so, and because Louisiana was the biggest slave market in the United States, it is the portal through which so many of the people who end up being enslaved in Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Arkansas, and elsewhere out west. Okay, so if your people at the end of the Civil War end up being enslaved, let's say in Mississippi or Alabama or Texas, you may think that's where your people were enslaved. Well, they may have only been enslaved there for a few years, right? 10 years maybe. And prior to that, their family was enslaved in Kentucky. And prior to that, they were enslaved, let's say, in Maryland. So because we have all these records in Kentucky, okay, there's so many, tens of thousands of families who could be, probably more like hundreds of thousands of families, who could be related to these folks who were enslaved in Kentucky. So if you had even one ancestor who was enslaved in Kentucky by a Catholic enslaver, there's a high probability that there are records in our database for that ancestor. And just having that one ancestor that you can find the name of, and then find their parents' names, maybe the grandparents' names, can give you a portal into the past that you would otherwise never be able to get if all you knew was at the point in time where the U.S. Census starts in 1870, where it's showing free black people. And let's say your people were in Mississippi. That might be the last point you can go farther. You can't go any farther back than that. You may even be able to learn who the enslavers were in Mississippi, okay? But you don't, that's all you know. You don't know that they purchased your ancestors in the slave market in New Orleans in 1856, and those people came from a farm in central Kentucky. Does that answer your question? You're muted.
Thank you for that response.
And now we have some questions.
Yes.
Okay.
We can start in order. A question from Tamika Roy is, have any church records of this kind been made available in the Canadian dioceses?
Great question. I don't know if this is the same person I've been corresponding with via email, but I've been corresponding with somebody in Ontario, specifically asking about the connection between enslaved Catholics in Kentucky in particular and enslaved Catholics in Ontario. And could there be relationships between those families? And the answer is yes, right? That's an easy one. So lots, I won't say lots of, but many of the people who escaped slavery and went to Canada either came from Kentucky or through Kentucky, okay? Because it was the most porous of states in terms of, so the Ohio River is north of Kentucky, and across the Ohio River you can get to Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, right? And those are the three major places that people come north through in this part of the country, in the Midwest, to get up to Canada, right? So, whether going through Michigan to Detroit, crossing over the Detroit River to go to Windsor in Ontario. So there's a direct, in the same way that people migrate, like during the Great Migration, people were going along certain train routes, like from Mississippi to Chicago, a good example. There are a lot of the routes that people took, where they ended up was purely based on like the easiest way to get from point A to point B. So long story short, I don't know of what records what efforts there are on the part of Catholic dioceses or archdioceses in Canada to make their records available. I haven't actually looked into it, to be very honest with you, but it's an intriguing thing because we know for a fact that Black families escaped, went to Canada, and either stayed in Canada or after the Civil War ended, returned back to the United States. There were entire communities of people, especially in Ohio and Indiana that I know of, who made that route. They escaped from Kentucky, went up to Canada, established themselves there in the 1840s, 1850s, into the 1860s. When the Civil War ended, they returned back to the United States, and they set up colonies, if you will, in those states, farm colonies, and the children in those families were born in Canada. So if they were Catholics, or if their enslavers were Catholics, then there's a high likelihood that there's a paper trail from one country to the other that can be followed. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
Thank you for the long-winded answer. What can you tell us about Tennessee, another bordering state of Kentucky?
Okay, so really great question. So Tennessee did not have its own diocese for some time. I don't know the exact history of this, but I know that the records for churches in Tennessee, those were actually part of the Louisville diocese, or archdiocese. Eventually becomes an archdiocese. So in other words, there's only one diocese for this entire region. So that it encompassed all of Kentucky, it encompassed Tennessee, it encompassed, I don't know, West Virginia, the various areas, until there were large enough Catholic communities in those places to establish their own diocese. Okay, so you actually, if you want to go look for early records of Tennessee churches, they might be in the archives of the Louisville Archdiocese. Antebellum records from slavery era.
Thank you, Dan. Interesting question here concerning Venerable Augustus Tolton, who's one of the African Americans on the path to sainthood. This person, Bernard Clark, is wondering, are there any accessible Catholic registers from Missouri parishes that might document enslaved families like his? And also, where can people search for records related to Tolton's, his actual family's baptismal or sacramental records?
Okay, so I think I know the answer to this question, but I may be mixing him up with another Black priest who is on the road to canonization, but I don't think there's two of them. So, but maybe there are.
There are, but
who's the other one?
I'm thinking of the same person because the other guy is from somewhere else.
Okay, then I do know this guy, the story of this family. So that family was enslaved in Meade County, Kentucky. And actually, we have the church records of that church, or at least we have one church from Meade County in our database. There is another church in Meade County that we have not been able to get the records of. We have them in paper form, but we haven't been able to transcribe them. They're in Latin. They're very hard to read. They're copies of photocopies, so they're extremely hard to read. But there is somebody who has digitized all of them, and I'm trying to get them to let us have their digitized copies. But his grandmother is buried in the cemetery of the Catholic Church in Meade County. It's called St. Teresa. And I've talked to the former priest of that church, who is now like sort of the emeritus priest, who actually is the one who dug up the records and got them digitized. So there's records of that family, of his mother and his grandmother, because they were both enslaved there in Meade County. So there are baptismal records, and at least baptismal records for his mother and grandmother there in that church. She took him, if I remember the story correctly, to Missouri. And so I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, actually, I think she took him farther north than that, if I remember the story. And then they ended up in St. Louis. Short answer is yes, there are records for him. But if you want to, if the question is what records are available for Missouri, to my knowledge, the St. Louis Archdiocese at least started a process of digitizing some of their records and putting them online. I don't know where they are in that process. I was sent a press release about this from somebody I think who's on this call, Ned Burkhausen. So I think that's knowable stuff, but they're either in the process of doing it or they started it. I don't frankly remember.
You beat me to it. I was going to shout out Deacon Ned. Another question here about, this was actually one of my questions from a while back. Are all the records on your database Catholics? I know the answer, but this person mentions they have Strother relatives and other families mentioned who come from Culpeper, Virginia, but they were Anglicans.
Okay, so short answer. We have focused on Catholic records so far only because they're the most accessible. The next most accessible set of records are the Anglican records, okay? So the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Church also did infant baptisms and still does, and sometimes included the name of the mother. I've yet to see anywhere the father is mentioned, but it's not unheard of to see child, mother and child's enslaver listed in their baptismal records. And so we started the process of looking at and digitizing records for, I think, 3 Episcopal churches. And we were working with a consortium of volunteers who were all Episcopals, who were trying to help us digitize other records from other Episcopal churches in Kentucky. That process stalled out. I never figured out why. They were all gung-ho about it, and then it just sort of fizzled. So I don't know what happened with that. But conceptually, yes, the Episcopal Church is the next most accessible set of baptismal records. It won't be exactly the same as what you can get with the Catholic Church records, but it's darn close. The next Protestant denomination that keeps the best records, or kept the best records for infant baptisms, is probably the Presbyterians and the Lutherans. So the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Episcopals, and the Catholics are the 4 churches I know of that consistently kept records. I won't say consistently, but did keep records of infant baptisms, in particular of enslaved children. They may or may not have also, I've never seen a marriage record in any of those churches. That doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means I've never heard of them. I've never seen one. But I have definitely seen baptismal records for Presbyterian, Lutheran, and Episcopal churches. And in particular, when you're talking about Virginia, where Episcopalianism would have been the dominant religion, although there are some Catholics there, that's what I would be looking at. And quite a few of those churches, by the way, have online records available through FamilySearch.org. In fact, FamilySearch.org has more digitized church records than any other place I know of in the world. If you go there and you search, so I'm seeing here, the St. Louis Catholic records are on Family Search. Yes. So they've done a really good job. If there are records available, if they could get to a particular archdiocese or diocese, and they would be allowed to microfilm their records, then they did that way back when, like in the 60s, 70s. More recently, I have been told that there was an edict from the Vatican saying, stop that. Don't do that, specifically with Family Search, because Family Search is affiliated with the Mormon Church. And the thinking went, they are apostates, I guess, let's not work with them anymore. So I was told this explicitly by someone at Family Search, that they have been told within the past just couple of years that they no longer are officially supposed to do business. So, but back in the 60s and 70s, they microfilmed thousands of Catholic churches, actually tens of thousands of Catholic churches all over the world.
I'll add that while I'm sure the Vatican does not like apostasy, I think the issue with the Mormons specifically is probably that those records might be used for their own.
Oh, that's correct. Yes, you're right. Yes,
baptism
you're absolutely right. It's to
which-
baptize people after death. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Which I somehow I would like to doubt that they would use records from ancestors.
They swear they're not doing that anymore, but let's not go there.
Sure. So, a question from Renea Henry. I know the name of an ancestor who moved from Kentucky to Louisiana during the Civil War, but I don't know why he was there. How can I find more records? As for Mississippi relatives, how do I find the name of the church with those records?
This is beyond my pay grade. This is the kind of thing that you probably need help from a genealogist to discern. My area of expertise is pretty squarely Kentucky. And then what I've heard about records that exist for Maryland, Louisiana, and Missouri in particular. So I do know that the New Orleans Archdiocese has put online all of their records. Well, no, I shouldn't. Let me be more precise. They've put a whole lot of microfilmed records. However, doesn't extend all the way to emancipation. They are largely from the 1700s, and they seem to top off in the early 1800s, if I remember correctly. That may have just been where they got to the last time I looked there. Maybe they're progressively adding more. So that would be a place to look. I will tell you that they're not, at least the last time I looked, they're not digitized, meaning they're not indexed in any way. They're digitized but not indexed, meaning you can physically look through a parish's records in chronological order as they exist in the church register, but there's no way to go looking for a person. Let's say you know the first name of an ancestor and you even know the year they were born. If you don't know what parish they were born in, it's a needle in a haystack, because there were an awful lot of Catholic churches in that diocese. Other questions?
Yes, one more, also from Tamika Roy, is in Canada. She confirms that she's the one you've been talking
Yes,
to.
yes, yes. I thought so.
How do you get a church or diocese? How do you get a diocese to release church records or documents?
Oh, so this is the $64,000 question. As I understand it, it is completely up to each individual diocese slash archdiocese as to whether they would be willing to let people who cannot prove that they are actual kin to the people in the records. It's totally up to them. It's whatever their internal policy is. I will tell you that the first time I asked the Louisville Archdiocese to open up their records, I was told categorically no, unless I had an ancestor. And I said, well, what if I was a Black person? And I don't know if I have an ancestor because of how my history of my family has been erased. But I think I have an ancestor that might have been in a certain parish or lived in a certain county. Can you let me go look? And the answer at the time was no. A day later, I got a phone call from the same place saying, we've talked it over and it would be okay as long as the records you want to look for are over 100 years old. Okay. So that's what I was told. So, however, it's still presumed that you knew what you were looking for. That's the caveat. You need to know what you're looking for. Like if you come to a particular, you can go to any archdiocese or diocese and say, I'm looking for the baptismal record of my great-grandmother so-and-so who was born in such and such a date, and their parish was such and such. That's not a problem, okay? Especially if you can prove your kin. But if you don't know the whereabouts or the precise name that they might have been baptized under, I don't know how you do it. So so that's why we're trying to get all the records opened up and digitized and indexed so you can do what we've done in Kentucky, which is you can put in the first name and the birth year, and you can then look at a long list of people who have that same name and birth year, and you can just see common names, right? You see that the names of their parents are familiar names to you from your family tree, right? And then so that's something you can do that nobody else could do, because you have that knowledge from your own family and what you know of your family's history and oral history of your family. So it's one of the very frustrating things. And I know, by the way, I want to just say, and I know Ned would say this if he were speaking, that there are efforts afoot within the church to open these records up, but it's an internal effort. It's not an external effort. So any change that's going to happen with this will probably happen with agitation from within the church, right? From the laity saying we'd really like this, and finding allies within the clergy and governance of the church to support that desire. And of course, it's about money, right? It costs money to index all these records. So there's that too, at a time when a lot of these dioceses and archdioceses are, closing schools, closing churches, running out of money. So that's a whole nother story that I know you've covered in depth in many of your previous articles, the why behind that. So.
Absolutely. And yeah, my own journey of trying to find Catholic records related to my family has been interesting, to say the least. So it's certainly the case that we have to kind of keep our foot on the pedal and, at some level putting pressure on the church to maybe change some policies that do probably unintentionally discriminate against people whose histories have been erased, as you said. And that is all of our questions. So I want to thank you for helping us uncover some history and get past the walls of secrecy that can block us from knowing the history of our family. So thank you so much for presenting this webinar.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nate, for having me. And, my email address is up on the screen. If somebody has a follow-up question, that we haven't covered, I'm happy to respond.
Thank you so
All
much.
right. Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And everyone be sure to visit the website.
reckoninginc.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.